Salve, sono Silvia.
Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Silvia Tosa. I'm a professor of English at the University for Foreigners of Siena, and I'm a member of the Queer Kinship group. We have established a research group and a network. We have a website, which we invite you to take a look at. We have a blog, we have a research seminar series like tonight, as well as conferences that we have organized and we'll keep organizing, and more about that will come later on. Charlotte and Paolo are the organizers together with me, so I leave the word to them.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Ross. I am Professor of Italian and Gender Studies at the University of Oxford, and I've been working on issues of queer kinship in my own research, but it's been really exciting over the past couple of years to be part of this, leading this growing network of interdisciplinary scholars from around the world, approaching this question from a variety of different perspectives. So we're really looking forward to the seminar today. Paolo.
Hey everybody, this is Paulo from Toronto. I teach in the Department of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies here at the University of Toronto. I'm very excited to be here, and we have a hopefully big announcement coming about the third iteration of our conference in Toronto in 2026. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Paolo. I'm really glad to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Kristin Mahoney. Welcome. Kristin is Professor of English and Faculty Fellow in the Center for Gender in a Global Context at Michigan State University. She's the author of Queer Kinship After Wild, Transnational Decadence and the Family, published for Cambridge University Press in 2022. Her work received honorable mention for the North American Victorian Studies Association Book Prize. And she also published another monographic work study for Cambridge University Press in 2015, entitled Literature and the Politics of Post-Victorian Decadence. Along with Kate Hext and Alex Murray, she's co-founder and co-editor of CUSP, Late 19th, Early 20th Century Cultures, Johns Hopkins University Press, which won the Council of Editors of Learned Journals Prize for Best New Journal in 2024. Along with Dustin Friedman, she also co-edited 19th Century Literature and Translation, the 1890s, in 2023, and she's currently working on a project tentatively entitled Love's Cross Currents, Indo-Irish Affinities, 1880-1930. And the title of her talk tonight is Theosophy and Transcultural Kinship. Welcome, Kristin, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say quickly before I get going, thank you so much to the organizers, to Sylvia, to Charlotte, to Paolo for inviting me to participate in this. I've been watching the work that you all have been doing as a part of the Queer Kinship Network, and I admire it so much. And I think this is such important work to be doing right now. So the material I'm going to be talking about today is part of my new project. I am very much at the beginning of this project. So I really, really welcome feedback. I welcome suggestions. There's still so much for me to learn about Theosophy. I'm very much a beginner when it comes to, I'm actually taking an introduction to Theosophy course. So I'm still learning quite a bit about this. So I really, really welcome feedback and suggestions. So on October 20th, 1931, the New York Herald Tribune reported that Jiddu Krishnamurti, a Hindu student who was heralded upon his arrival here several years ago by Mrs. Annie Besant as the vehicle of truth, the second Messiah, and voice of the great teacher, had renounced Theosophy and the claims that Mrs. Besant had made for him. Besant, he acknowledged, seemed to have believed with all sincerity that she had discovered in him the vehicle of truth. But as he matured, he came to see the error into which he had been led, possibly by emotional ardor. Krishnamurti was at this point newly independent, having only recently extricated himself from the movement that had removed him from his biological family when he was 14 years old. In 1909, Besant had convinced Krishnamurti's father, Narayanaya, who was living at the time in a home just outside the Theosophical Society headquarters in Madras, now Chennai, to sign a letter appointing her as a guardian to both Krishnamurti and his younger brother Nitya. The young Messiah had been discovered on the TS grounds at Adyar by her close associate, Charles W. Leadbeater. Leadbeater had determined through examination of the boy's aura and past lives that his destiny was to be the vehicle on earth of the world teacher, or Lord Maitreya, an enlightened being who would bring to the world new truths and usher in a new era. And this is what I'm showing you here is the table of lives that is supposed to be all of the lives that Krishnamurti lived in the past. And this is at the special collections of the Theosophical Society in Wheaton, Illinois. So as a result, Krishnamurti was gradually extracted from his family and moved to the Theosophical Society grounds at Adyar, where he was tutored by Leadbeater and his associates. For 5 months, Leadbeater took Krishnamurti each evening in his astral form to visit the Master of Wisdom, Kutumi, and then recorded this knowledge in the morning, constructing a set of instructions concerning the value of discrimination, desirelessness, good conduct, and love that were in turn published as a book entitled At the Feet of the Master in 1910. Within a year, the little book had been translated into 22 different languages. Finally, after a brief probation, Krishnamurti was locked under Besant's authority in her bedroom with Leadbeater for 36 hours to undergo his initiation into the occult sciences. And this despite the fact that Leadbeater had only recently been readmitted to the TS after being asked to resign following charges of sexual misconduct with young boys. When less than a year later, Narayanaya initiated court proceedings to regain custody of his sons, he alleged that Leadbeater had engaged in unnatural offenses with Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was placed at the center of the operations of the Theosophical Society, as well as a new organization dedicated to preparing for the coming of the world teacher, the Order of the Star in the East, which launched its own quarterly magazine, the Herald of the Star, as well as star shops in London and Hollywood, and eventually regular star camps in Ojai, India, and the Netherlands, dedicated to the celebration of the world teacher's arrival. He was removed from India, brought to London and Paris in the United States, outfitted in European clothes, brought to theosophical meetings and garden parties, the holes in his ears sewn up and his teeth straightened to prepare his body to operate as a suitable vehicle for the Lord Maitreya. Besant referred to Krishnamurti throughout this period as her darling son, and he in turn referred to her as Amma and beloved mother. Together with Krishnamurti and his brother Nitya and a rotating cast of mentors, foster fathers, and elder brothers, Besant formed an occult family dedicated to the rearing of the new world teacher, with herself at the head as the benevolent mother of the Messiah. However, in the 1920s, for reasons that I'll be discussing today, Krishnamurti grew increasingly disenchanted with the Theosophical Society and its plans for him, and dissolved the Order of the Star at the annual Star Camp in the Netherlands in 1929. The talk I'll be giving today emerges from my new project, Love's Crosscurrents, Indo-Irish Affinities, 1880 to 1930, which focuses on the trouble caused by the concept of love within transcultural coalitions between Irish and Indian subjects at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. This new project carries forward the concerns of my most recent book on queer kinship by attending to unconventional intimacies and affiliations. Queer Kinship After Wilde considered the persistent influence of Oscar Wilde and the decadent movement's radical thinking concerning the concept of kinship from the fin de siècle into the modernist moment. Members of the decadent movement worked to rethink the family, community, and desire, and they often performed this work in conversation with friends and literary works from abroad. As I argue in Queer Kinship After Wilde, the ideas of these 19th century decadent precursors operated as models for a new generation of artists and writers in the 20th century who wished to operate outside the boundaries of the conventional heteronormative family. The representation of eroticism and kinship in the works of modernist sculptor Eric Gill, for example, is inflected by his contact with queer decadent Catholicism as practiced by Michael Field or Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper, and the decadent poet and priest John Gray. The Harlem Renaissance author and illustrator Richard Bruce Nugent drew heavily from Wilde and the decadent illustrator Aubrey Beardsley in his representation of incest. Like their Victorian antecedents, these thinkers drew upon a global set of ideas concerning kinship, and they traveled widely, encountering vastly different models of connection and cooperation as they worked to disentangle themselves from England's sexual and gender ideals and generate new ways of conceiving of familial networks and community. Compton and Faith Mackenzie, for example, remade their marriage in conversation with the queer cosmopolitan community on the island of Capri in the 1910s and 20s, opening up their tie to accommodate connections with other partners. Eric Gill routed his vision of divine eroticized kinship through his study of Indian art history and his engagement with the Ceylonese art historian Ananda Coomaraswamy. The decadent modernist Harold Acton insulated himself from his troubled biological family and the pressure to marry by removing himself from Europe in the 1930s and resettling in China, where he taught modernist poetry and collaborated with modern Chinese poets. And he reflected in his fiction of this period on the manner in which the practice of global decadence facilitates withdrawal from heteronormative forms of affiliation. The decadent illustrator Lawrence Hausman came to understand ideal kinship as infinitely expansive through his advocacy work in support of Indian independence. And Vivian Holland's thinking about affiliation in the family was informed by his work translating queer modernist texts written in French. For the Harlem Renaissance artist Richard Bruce Nugent, engaging with the Orientalism of British decadence assisted him in theorizing the rupture of Black kinship structures in the United States. So what I argue in that book is that attending to the work of these authors and artists allows us to see how Victorian decadence's ideas about the family were revised, reformulated, and inflected with a cosmopolitan sensibility by a network of bohemian 20th century figures who ensured that Wildian and decadent notions of kinship remained a vital part of conversations concerning sexuality and the family during the modernist period. And I was saying to Sylvia yesterday when we spoke quickly that when I was first presenting some of this work from this new project, I was telling everyone, this work is so different. I've moved in a completely different direction. And then I presented some of this new material and they're like, it's still queer kinship. And I was like, you're right, it is. It is still a queer kinship project. So in this new project, I'm interested in the ways that unruly, non-normative kinship connections, which are meant to operate as the foundation of revolutionary or decolonial futures, are destabilized and delimited by ardent and excessive affections that result in over-identification, extraction, absorption, and appropriation. I wanted to open with Krishnamurti's comments to the Tribune because he's identifying there the same problem with which this project is preoccupied, the connection between ardor and errors, between love and mistakes. He's been led, he argues, into error by love, by passion, by deeply felt emotion and affection, though it's unclear in this formulation if it's within himself or his adoptive mother that this tremendous and mistaken passion is located. Regardless, someone loved someone too much and in the wrong ways, and mistakes ensued. The rest of Krishnamurti's life was devoted to the long process of righting these errors, of carving out for himself a path to liberation from the structures imposed on his thinking by the occult movement that had taken him from his home. Besant's ardent love for Krishnamurti, I plan to argue, might be understood as a form of queer transcultural kinship, an Indo-Irish familial structure emerging from a global occult practice that fostered intimate connections between and anti-colonial activism by Irish and Indian subjects. Besant's first marriage had resulted in legal separation, and her biological daughter had been taken from her after a custody battle following her prosecution under the Obscene Publications Act for disseminating literature about contraception. After her move to India, however, she built for herself a new alternative non-normative family that operated across national, racial, and religious distinctions, enacting theosophical ideas about universal brotherhood, which is their central tenet, and also ideas about reincarnation function quite a bit in this form of connection, thereby allowing Krishnamurti's adoption to be understood as both righteous and a reunion, an anti-racist love, as well as a repetition of a familial tie that had recurred across eons. Besant's adoption of an Indian boy had much to do with her adoption of India as her motherland, with the Theosophical Society's vision of and place within Indian culture, with her strategic adoption of Irish identity at key moments within her career, with the linkage of Indian and Irish identities within Theosophical evolutionary theory, and Besant's vexed form of anti-colonial critique. So in the time I have today, I'd like to think through the manner in which a rhetoric of love and kinship intersects with theosophical temporalities to enmesh Krishnamurti and to consider in turn how the concept of liberation functions within his adoption into the movement, as well as his departure from it. Krishnamurti is seduced into a non-normative familial formation via a strange brew of theosophical ideas about messianic time, reincarnation, and evolution, and forced into an ongoing confrontation with the society's unique ethos of liberation. However, as he matures, he develops his own distinct definition of liberation that operates in a distinct temporal register, privileging freedom now, as opposed to potential spiritual liberation in some distant future. And this is what facilitates his rescue, his self-extraction from a kinship tie that simultaneously centered and silenced him, that established him as the leader of a movement as well as its most restricted member. And all of this must be understood within the context of the linked discourses of anti-colonial critique and decolonial liberation happening in India and Ireland and routed through the Theosophical Society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So insisting upon the common foundations and connectedness of world religions, and that is the kind of Theosophy's central tenet, is looking at these kinds of core beliefs that are shared amongst world religions. Theosophy did facilitate cross-cultural intimacy and collaboration. As Joy Dixon has argued, Theosophy, as a colonial syncretic religion, operated as a contact zone where relations between colonizer and colonized were renegotiated and in which both parties could be transformed. I'm interested, in addition, in the ways in which Theosophy operated as a contact zone between colonized and colonized, a mode of transcultural affiliation that positioned, as Joseph Leonard has argued, Irish and Indian cultures in a cross-cultural continuum that's neither cosmopolitan nor metropolitan, but peripheral and circumreferential. This ethos could have radical and resistant effects, creating an institutional space for disaffected Irish and Indian subjects to engage with and collaborate with one another in the establishment of anti-colonial organizations and periodicals, Celtic and Hindu cultural revival projects, as well as pedagogical missions that centered Irish and Indian traditions. Scholars of Theosophy have highlighted the role that the movement played in the cultivation and development of nationalist sentiment in India. Marc Bevier, for example, has argued that Besant's brand of Theosophy, which centered Hinduism, served in India as an integral part of a wider neo-Hinduism, which helped provide Indian nationalists with a legitimating ideology, a newfound confidence, and experience of organization. Nevertheless, as Gary Viswanathan has argued, relationships of power are never fully suspended within the TS, due in part to the movement's investment in ideas of racial hierarchy and evolution. The theosophical vision of time and change often worked at odds with the idea of anti-colonial liberation, positing individuals as cogs within a larger machine of spiritual evolution in service to a more significant process of true and enlightened liberation and oneness, the emergence of a new world commonwealth and a new race. We don't tend to stress Besant's Irishness in current scholarly conversations about the history of Theosophy. However, while she was born in London, she insisted that 3/4 of her blood and all of her heart were Irish, and she chose to deploy this identification at key strategic moments. Registering herself, for example, as a representative of Ireland at a theosophical gathering just prior to the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893. She also exhibited a commitment to anti-colonial critique across her long career. As the Ceylonese theosophist C. Janasa noted in an essay penned beside her deathbed called Annie Besant Warrior, this is 1933, Theosophists understood her to be a fighter who championed the cause of Afghanistan in 1879, of the Transvaal in 1881, of Ireland in 1882 and afterwards, of Egypt in 1882, of the Sudan in 1885, a champion of the oppressed, untiring in her fight for justice against injustice. Following her conversion to Theosophy in the 1890s, she frequently twinned India and Ireland within her political and spiritual thinking, speaking on her lecture tours of, quote, a long process of racial and cultural evolution, out of which Ireland was ultimately to emerge as the spiritual mentor of Europe, even as India had long been to Asia. In establishing, along with Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the All India Home Rule League, she looked to Irish nationalist practices as a model, adopting a policy of Irish obstruction. And she refers to herself as Irish in the internment diary she kept following her arrest for political agitation under the Defense of India Act, thereby linking herself to a longer tradition of Irish political incarceration. And I was able to consult this diary during a research trip to the international headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Chennai, India this past spring. And those are the steps of the archive where I ate my lunch every day. It was a very lovely research trip. But her internment itself arose from the coupling of Irish and Indian anti-colonial struggles. As Anne Taylor notes in her biography of Besant, the governor of Madras, Lord Pentland, wrote to the Secretary of State for India in 1916, voicing concerns about Besant's use of her newspaper, New India, to recruit members to the organizations she had founded, such as the Young Men's India Association, which was established in opposition to the Young Men's Christian Association. And Besant had cast that organization in New India as anti-Hindu and therefore anti-India. But what worried Pentland more than anything, Taylor notes, was her importation of the Irish nationalist poet James Cousins to be the literary sub-editor of New India. When Cousins published a response to the Easter Rising, describing the disturbance as, quote, the reaction of a quick and proud race to the vacillation and ineptitude to the passing of the Home Rule Bill displayed by the Liberal government, the resultant outrage forced Besant to dismiss him from the paper. The government of Madras, nevertheless, determined that this, in conjunction with many other articles expressing disaffection in New India, had brought the government into hatred and contempt. She was externed from Bombay and the central provinces, and finally, after representing men who killed policemen in Calcutta as noble martyrs in the pages of New India, she was interned for 3 months at the hill station at Uttacommand. Besant's perceived Irishness was coupled with her advocacy for Indian independence, both within her own thinking and by her critics, and her sense of herself as Irish, I'm arguing, undergirded her over-identification with Indian causes and people, her sense of entitlement to a position of leadership within Indian anti-colonial organizations, of herself as the builder of a new India, as well as her feelings of intimacy or kinship with Indian individuals. And she actually referred to being Irish as the next thing to being Indian, and she seemed at times to even understand the two as equivalent. The president of the All India Home Rule League, Subramania Iyer, noted in 1917 that she, quote, repeatedly stated her own belief that in her previous lives, she has again and again been born in India, and that her present Western birth is only for the purpose of supplementing her Indian character with something of the Western in order that she might do better her work for the organization of India. Her past lives and her political commitments in her eyes made identification with India as available as identifying with Ireland. And she herself raised the question in 1916, who shall deny me the right to call myself a child of the motherland when I suffer for her dear sake? And it is the thing I'm trying to stress is this kind of use of kinship language across all of these ways of conceptualizing affiliation. And the sense of kinship with India, of being a child of the motherland, was as likely to yield pleasing political results, such as the production of New India, which provided an important forum for anti-colonial communication across India, as more complicated outcomes, such as the extraction of a child from his family to operate as a living symbol for spiritual rebirth. Besant understood the STAR project as intimately connected with the Indian struggle for home rule. A March 1915 article on the Indian work of our protector in the Herald of the Star makes explicit this connection, stating, quote, it is well known that Besant believes that the coming teacher will take an Eastern body. For her, therefore, the position of the Oriental in the world, the respect in which he is held, his political status, his relation to the white races, are all consequently matters of the most urgent and vital importance, for they concern the great teacher himself. For the world to receive the coming Messiah, they must be primed to apprehend his manifestation in Indian form. As this very same article makes clear, however, Besant's vision of Indian liberation was complex and compromised by her vision of the coming new age, which saw India occupying dominion status, remaining entangled with England, albeit with a greater degree of autonomy. One of the great principles guiding Besant's work, it is argued, is that India has a great imperial future and that her destiny is inextricably linked with that of England, but that the only terms on which she can enter the future are those of equality of treatment with the white race. Gauri Viswanathan has described Besant's approach to home rule as emerging from a relational model of the Commonwealth, which spurns rule by force without fully surrendering the concept of empire. The relational Commonwealth model adopted elements of theosophical rhetoric concerning both kinship and hierarchy. Theosophy's central tenet is, of course, universal brotherhood. This is the core tenet of theosophy. But this concept does not necessarily signify equality. This vision of universal brotherhood instead speaks to a shared origin, all things, all creatures, all people emanating from a divine source. But Theosophy understands this emanation and development in terms of evolution, promoting a vision of 7 root races and the emergence of finer and finer types over time. While Celtic peoples and Hindu-Aryans represented a 5th Aryan root race, superior to the persisting Lemurian types evident in Africa or the indigenous tribes of Australia, they would be superseded by the 6th root race, which was slated to appear in California. As Viswanathan notes, Besant maintained, and these are Besant's words, humanity is brotherhood, but brotherhood does not mean identity, and brotherhood does not imply a flat, dead level of absolute similarity and so-called equality. The genius of the empire is to make every nation that you conquer feel that you bring them into the imperial family, that they and you from that time forward are brothers. The rhetoric of kinship of an imperial family functions as much here to preserve the imperial future as it does to elevate the status of India. India must remain within this kinship tie to ensure that its spiritual ideas can continue to inflect the operations of the metropole and the wider world. The English nation, in Besant's word, was, quote, to blend with the Indian nation in the building up now of the world empire to be really a world commonwealth, a cross-fertilization that would allow for the further elevation and evolution of the race. The move to home rule within the schema it will be only one tiny step in a generations-long evolution to an ideal theosophical future, a world commonwealth of unified nations of global oneness. These ideas about evolution, deep time, and development also operate at the center of Besant's imagined kinship tie with her adopted son. On November 29th, 1911, she sent a strange and tender letter to Krishnamurti that described to the boy the incredible duration of their kinship scheme, assuring the boy of the historical continuities underwriting their love for one another. And I'm going to read this letter out loud because this is kind of the core of the argument of the chapter. My darling son, I'm thinking so much of you and sending you big waves of love like those that come tumbling in through the opening of the bar. Only they do not knock you about, but only envelop and guard the precious body that our Lord will wear. I love my own dear Krishna, the ego that I have loved for so many, many years. How many, I do not know. Since we were leaping animals and guarded our master's hut, perhaps longer still. Perhaps when we were plants, we put delicate tendrils to each other in the sunshine and the storms. And perhaps when we were minerals, oh so very long ago, I was a bit of crystal and you a bit of gold in me. And for ages and ages to come, Krishna mine, we shall love and help each other to help our race. How glorious it all is. And our loved brother Charles, too, has been with us, and you and he the elder, you the younger, are marked with the blessing sign of the Buddha to be. The blessing of the great brotherhood is on you, my loved one, and I, its servant, am glad and proud to love and serve you. Signed, Heracles. So Heracles is Besant's star name, given to her by Leadbeater as he composed the Lives of Alcyone, and Alcyone was Krishnamurti's star name. This is a work that delineated Krishnamurti's past lives and made the case that a particular group of key theosophists, the Band of Servers, had since 70,000 BC been brought together, reincarnation after reincarnation, to form a perpetually transforming but highly resilient kinship scheme of mothers and fathers and sons and daughters centered upon Krishnamurti. The Lives of Alcyone demonstrated that Besant and Krishnamurti had been linked across lifetimes, sometimes as mother and son, at others as siblings. In life number 28, for example, which according to Ernest Wood was investigated and written by Besant herself, Heracles and Alcyone are sisters, daughter of Mercury, a leader in a conquering army who settled in Bengal circa 15,000 BC. After their brother Vajra, and that was Madame Blavatsky's star name, suppresses the local Atlantean religion, a form of dark magic, Heracles, who practices a new syncretic form of white magic, is abducted along with her younger sister by members of the Atlantean priesthood. And I'm going to read this passage out as well because it's just so lurid and intense. At a sign, the women were seized and lifted upon a high altar in view of all, and a lurid light, blood red, shone out, none could say whence, and threw the awful figures around into grim semblance of life. There was a sound of rending cloth, and the robes of the two women were torn from them, and the fair white bodies shone out nude and shrinking. A low cry of horror burst from them, and then Heracles threw up her proud head and flung her arms around her sister, striving to shield her from the gaze of the rough crowd. How tell the horrors that ensued? Flames rose from surrounding altars, and shrieking captives were led in, and the fire fed with fat skinned from their living bodies, till the flames roared high. Then their blood was set flowing and caught in iron vessels, and set to boil in huge iron pots, and poured upon the images set in the circle round. Foul creatures of the slime, huge spiders, monstrous scorpions, fed on the remnants of the slime. Huge spiders, monstrous scorpions fed on the remnants of the mutilated bodies, and presently one after another of the images woke into awful life, began to stir, to slip downwards from their pedestals, obscene images of unimaginable horror, and crawled and writhed towards the center where Alcyone and Heracles still stood, clasped in each other's arms. So then Heracles summons the sun god Surya to rescue the souls, or what Theosophists would call the causal bodies of the two sisters. The temple collapses, and an earthquake and a tidal wave devastate the land as the sisters' souls ascend into the light. So, according to all of these stories, Bessa and Krishnamurti have protected and cared for one another across eons. They've operated repeatedly with courage in the face of religious persecution and sacrificed together again and again for the sake of their faith. This is a story that recurs, with each repetition more tightly binding the causal bodies of these spiritual kin. Besant's correspondence with her adopted son relies similarly on this sense of eternally recurring connection. Theosophy's vision of universal brotherhood, which stressed the common origins of all life in a divine source, turned attention to the longue durée, the Ionian nature of the connections that would contribute to the world-shaking shifts in consciousness and political organization for which the Theosophical Society was always preparing. And the theosophical investment in the concept of reincarnation allowed the solidarities enabling these shifts to be understood as connections that had operated across multiple lives. In this letter, for example, Annie Besant is speaking to Krishnamurti as a son and a messiah, as the body the Lord will wear when he arrives, and at the same time as a consciousness to which she has been linked in prehistoric times as well as pre-human times. They were animals together, plants together, even minerals together. And as they continue to evolve and change, as he emerges as the world teacher and initiates a new era, they'll continue to love and help each other for ages and ages to come. They're together on the precipice of something enormous that is at the same time only one moment within their many epochs of love. They are also significantly a mother and a son, a kinship formation that signals a form of intimate transcultural solidarity and that facilitates Indian cultural revival, as Besant births and nurtures a world teacher whose light emanates from the East. In life number 28, along with this strange letter, Besant turns her authorial powers to the deployment of a poetics of kinship adorned in the style of weird fiction or popular science to construct an appeal to familial feeling that is at times rousing and lurid and others serene and learned, but always seductive, always difficult to refuse. This reliance on kinship language to do the work of national rebirth and cultural revival is, of course, quite common. We're accustomed to hearing about motherlands and their sons, or of solidarities conceptualized as sibling relationships, of Mother India and Sons of Ireland, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. What emerges so clearly within this particular dynamic, however, is how disorienting this muddying of the intimate and the political can be, as personal relationships stand in for broader transimperial solidarities, and real bodies, real children, are asked to stand for pasts and futures, made to believe that their fates are bound up in and determined by deep time, mystical continuities, and the wisdom of a family member who has been guiding them to this radical future across multiple lives. Krishnamurti's own work as a writer across his career registers his efforts to disentangle himself from this incredibly complicated and robust system of non-normative kinship ties. The authorship of the first work linked to his name, At the Feet of the Master, has been vigorously disputed, composed as it was when Krishnamurti was so young, in the process of learning to read and write and acquiring English language. Its very title, however, speaks to his position at this stage as a disciple, receiving wisdom from a superior. And its contents, which the foreword asserts are not the child's words, but the words of his master, quote, without whom he could have done nothing, end quote, stress obedience, duty, good conduct, and the extinguishing of desire. Quote, in the light of his holy presence, all desire dies, but the desire to be like him. The authorship of Education as Service, published 2 years later, seems similarly questionable, in this case bearing the mark of his tutor, George Arundel. But this is, again, a work ascribed to the child that stresses holy and imperative duty, self-control, and the position of the individual within a larger framework that supersedes that individual's own agency and desire. Young boys should be taught, the work insists, to be of service in the little family of the school, an ethos that will, quote, naturally widen out into the service of the large family of the nation. The pedagogy articulated here reinscribes hierarchy. Quote, all who know the truth of reincarnation should realize that they are members of one great family, in which some are younger brethren and some elder, as well as imperial structures. Quote, both Indian and English teachers should try to make good feeling between the two races living side by side, so that they may join in common work for the one empire. Kinship language functions here, again, much as it did in Besant's prose, to make constructed connections appear natural and eternal, positing the claims of nation, empire, and spiritual evolution as inescapable and superior to individual desire. A very different message, however, begins to emerge in the works written by Krishnamurti's own pen that were composed following the loss of his brother Nitya. Nitya had been suffering from tuberculosis for years, but his health deteriorated even further in 1925, and as Krishnamurti was shuttled around the world to make messianic appearances, his brother was sent to Ojai, California to get well. Krishnamurti visited the masters on the astral plane and begged for the protection of his beloved brother, pledging to sacrifice his happiness or anything that was required to let Nitya live, and he had been assured, quote, "He will be well." At the same time, tensions within the leadership of the Theosophical Society escalated as Krishnamurti's rivals endeavored to raise their own status and power within the TS hierarchy. Besant, Leadbeater, as well as Krishnamurti's former tutor, George Arundel, and his much younger wife, Rukmini Devi, testified during this period that they had undergone a fifth and final initiation and become adepts, or masters of the occult sciences. And Besant announced the founding of a new world religion and world university. Krishnamurti expressed skepticism about these new initiations and ambitious aspirations, but he was told his brother's life might be spared if he acknowledged these recent initiates as adepts. While sailing to India, however, a telegram arrived announcing his brother's death, news that, according to his companion, Shiva Rao, quote, broke him completely and shattered his entire philosophy of life, the implicit faith in the future, as outlined by Mrs. Besant and Mr. Leadbeater, Nitya's part in it, all appeared shattered at the moment, end quote. Krishnamurti distanced himself increasingly from the Theosophical Society in the years that followed, and he finally dissolved the Order of the Star at the annual Star Camp in the Netherlands in 1929, extricating his body as messianic vehicle from the operations of Theosophical temporality. He turned during the period following Nitya's passing to a rhetoric of radical freedom and individualism that countered the structures of Theosophy that had so fundamentally restricted his life, developing a discourse of resistance to spiritual organizations, or cages as he called them, in favor of self-guided truth-seeking, which he would adumbrate for the rest of his life. In a set of lectures delivered in the Netherlands in 1927, for example, Who Brings the Truth and by What Authority, Krishnamurti reveals a new self bent on the questioning of authority, encouraging his listeners to not to obey, but to understand, to locate and comprehend the truth independent of outside spiritual guides and systems. For 16 years, he told his audience, you've worshiped the picture which is not spoken, which you have interpreted as you pleased. You were able to hold that picture because that picture did not speak, it was not alive. But now that the picture becomes alive and speaks, you say, can that picture which I worshiped be right? Can it speak? Has it any authority? He rejects the adoration of his form, as well as the theosophical hierarchies that have rendered him at once magical and silent. And as he comes into possession of his own sense of authority, he calls for revolt on the part of every one of his listeners. Each listener is invited to replicate Krishnamurti's turn away from structure, discipline, and guidance to locate for themselves, as he has, their own path to enlightenment. The ceremonies of the Theosophical Society, the veneration of the world teacher in the form of Krishnamurti, all established dogmas, creeds, and philosophies lead away from liberation, which may only be located by the individual for whom no books and no schools may serve as a guide. It is no longer necessary within this approach to liberation to wade gradually through initiations, discipleships, and ceremonies. Now is the time to live, to understand the meaning of life, and no longer to wait. Liberation to be pursued individually and attained rapidly, rather than according to established patterns and rituals or by some future more evolved root race, became the insistent refrain of his writing in this period. The leadership of the TS sensed immediately the manner in which Krishnamurti's new rhetoric opposed their own highly ordered and gradual approach to the pursuit of enlightenment. They countered that rhetoric and contested the authority of the very figure that they had placed at the center of their kinship scheme for decades. The critique came from all sides, from former mentors, younger rivals, and even his adopted mother. In a speech delivered to the esoteric section, the inner group of the TS most devoted to discipline and the study of practical occultism, Leadbeater, for example, acknowledged that while, quote, Krishnamurti had been emphasizing liberation very much during his talks, liberation for most of the ES members is a thing that they can only attain by degrees. He knew that Krishnamurti spoke of leaping to the ultimate liberation, but it's hardly a possibility yet for most of them. In any case, Leadbeater added, Krishnamurti sometimes misused the term liberation. In a public statement on Krishnamurti's teachings, his former tutor, Jinnarajadasa, stated that while liberation is a technical term in theosophical literature, Krishnamurti used it in a new way. Quote, when he stated that any man, even a savage, could attain liberation, he naturally seemed to challenge the whole principle of evolutionary unfoldment, which is a theosophical maxim. Dr. Besant herself, Dhanurajadasa notes, told him, he doesn't mean by liberation what we mean. Dhanurajadasa would later recollect in 1927, when our theosophical ideals were being denounced by Krishnaji's immediate circle at Amen, the chief, in one of her addresses, pointed out that the ideal of liberation was very beautiful, but there was something to her more beautiful still, and that was to renounce liberation in order to help mankind. Here, the mother who has loved Alcyone since he was a mineral implies that his new ethos amounts to self-interest, an excessive mode of individualism that turns away from the theosophical ideals of sacrifice and service. The disagreements here around meaning, temporality, and appeal of liberation must be understood in the context of Besant's broader plan for India. Her specific vision of decolonization that leads to dominion status, her gradualist approach to both political change, which produces new types of trans-imperial entanglement that bring colonized people into more intimate relation, into kinship with colonizing powers. Krishnamurti's impatient and rapid mode of self-determination flies in the face of this theosophical tendency to think in terms of slow processes of change, moving always towards union. His vision of a rapid path to freedom, of radical agency and individualism, speaks to a desperate desire to disentangle himself from kinship ties that he had been told for his entire life stretched backward into a past so long ago it predates human consciousness and into a future so eternal it was beyond imagination. These ties always stood within Besant's worldview for broader networks of transcultural connection, networks that had to be understood as similarly permanent and eternal. One can see why Krishnamurti might wish to understand them differently. During this period, as Besant became increasingly troubled by the unruliness of her rebellious son, she located for herself another young person who might operate similarly as a beacon for change, a youthful Indian body to which theosophical adherence might turn as a concrete symbol for the coming New World Order. Speaking at the Star Camp in 1925, Besant referred to, quote, one whom I've called my daughter, Rukmini Arundel, this Indian girl of glorious past, young in body, yet old in wisdom and willpower. As one child began to disentangle himself from the transhistorical, transcultural kinship narratives that had drawn him from his brother's sickbed, Besant deployed a similar script of familial intimacy forged across generations of a youthful figure with links to eternity, to the glorious past, who might initiate rebirth and revival, and who importantly was her daughter. Following a sermon concerning the imminent arrival of the World Mother at the Liberal Catholic Church on the Adyar grounds in March of 1928, Besant published a new periodical, The World Mother, which heralded the arrival of a great spiritual being who represents the feminine side of divinity in a concrete form, who would initiate the new dawning of the mother life and once again a new India, for she would operate for the nation as a perfect example of the power and sacrifice of citizenship. Alongside the annunciation of her new messianic child, Besant published a poem to the World Mother by Rukmini Devi Arundel, the young Tamil woman who had married Besant's close associate and Krishnamurti's tutor, George Arundel, 26 years her senior, at the age of 16. Besant had enthusiastically supported the union, and Rukmini had been pulled, like her precursor, by Besant and Arundel into a whirlwind of theosophical activity, shuttled around the globe, thrust into contact with an entire network of occultists for whom she operated as an object of exotic fascination. The story recurs, despite the defection of its main character, to unfold another youthful Indian body into a spiritual narrative that spreads across eternity, absorbing her identity and her nation into a telos that does not serve either. And this is my final paragraph. So these are errors born of emotional ardor, mistakes that emerge from love. Besant relied on the language of love, a rhetoric of kinship and connection, to attract the beloved young people she placed at the center of her theosophical millenarianism. Both Krishnamurti and Rukmini Devi managed to forge for themselves different paths to extricate themselves from the seductive kinship mythologies generated by their adoptive mother. But they insisted until the end that they too loved her. Reflecting upon what she referred to as Besant's perfect life years later, Rukmini Devi stated, all her fairy devotion she gave to India. Although I am Indian, I learned what it is to love this country from her. What exactly did she learn about loving her own country from Besant? What was she taught about the dangers and disappointments that accompany the placing of love or kinship at the center of political praxis? About the deployment of non-normative kinship connections to cement transcultural connection? Besant leveraged intimacy for political purposes, and generated an entire set of transcultural familial ties. And love was at the center of that. Love that she insisted predated the advent of humanity and that would persist into the new era that all these sacrifices necessitated. When Krishnamurti in 1975 reflected back on his youth amidst the Theosophists, he asserted that the only one who was close to inner transformation was Annie Besant. When asked why he thought so, he replied, "You don't know how great her capacity for love was." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristin. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. It was such a rich and thought-provoking seminar. Thank you. Your analysis of Theosophy's relational imaginaries and the way in which all of them, in particular Annie Besant's work, illuminate alternative forms of affiliations and care, really offered today a compelling contribution to our ongoing discussion on transnational kinship. So thank you very much. And also, I have lots of questions, and I would like to start to ask you how, by asking you how the relationship, between the theosophical notions of universal brotherhood and non-biological kinship and ties that you illustrated today enabled new forms of transnational affiliation. In particular, I would like to know how these ideals worked and operated alongside the structures of British imperial power. Think in India, of course, and in the second half of the 19th century in particular, the British Empire was particularly strong, in terms also as a structure. The army was very well consolidated, and so I was just thinking how, from an institutional viewpoint, these two things somehow went along or did not, especially because these transnational affiliations, this kind of relation and dialogue that you have, shown us across letters, texts, works, people, bodies, thoughts, embodied really in social practices as well, lived alongside a much broader context, embedded with this colonial really framing. So yeah, that's my question, if I managed to sort of
Yeah, no,
because there's so many ideas I'm trying to process at the moment. So thank you so much. I mean, I'm trying to articulate lots of the questions that really, really compel me at the moment. So thank you.
Those are the exact questions that are compelling me. I think like when I started doing the research, so I had a sabbatical last year, and that was really when I just started doing the research for this project, at which point I really knew almost nothing about Theosophy. I mean, I knew what we all know, like when you're kind of trained as a Victorianist, the kinds of things that you hear, but I don't think I understood how long and rich its history was and the kinds of political roles that it had performed. So when I started doing the research for this project, I went to Notre Dame actually to do some work in their archives because they have such rich holdings in Irish studies. And that's when I started to look at figures like A.E., James Cousins, James Stevens, who were all so deeply, deeply invested in Theosophy. And then I started to read more about Besant and think about the ways that she sort of strategically deployed this kind of vision of herself as Irish at key moments. And as I was doing this kind of initial research for the project, it became more and more clear to me that Theosophy was the site, the kind of locus through which so many of these Irish and Indian subjects were finding their way to each other at this particular period, and that the friendships, because I knew that I wanted to be thinking about anti-colonial solidarities, anti-colonial intimacies, anti-colonial affections. It's just kind of thinking about solidarity. It became really, really clear to me, right, that the kinds of, like you were saying, the kinds of the kind of institutional structures that Theosophy created were this kind of perfect conduit for Irish and Indian thinkers to find their way to one another. And that was happening. There was kind of movement happening back and forth. So I think a lot of people are familiar with Yeats's investment in Theosophy, which was a kind of brief moment early on in his career, but I think it does continue to inform his thinking afterwards. But he was in conversation with people like A.E. and Charles Johnston in Dublin, who were kind of getting interested in esoteric thinking. And Madame Blavatsky sent one of her comrades, Mohini Chatterjee, to Dublin to speak to the people there, and that had this kind of like absolutely transformative effect on Yeats, on AE, and that's like the kind of the Dublin Theosophical Lodge was established after his visit. So I think, and then I think that there's a way in which the kind of the way that that sort of Hindu traditions are centered within Theosophy is inspiring to people like Yeats and AE who kind of see in that the kind of possibility for a recentering of Celtic traditions and kind of like Irish mythologies, and that the way that that could be central to a form of kind of nationalist cultural revival. So I think that that's like the Mohini Chatterjee's visit to Dublin and the way that kind of Theosophy finds its way to Dublin at that moment really does have this kind of crucial role in the way that the kind of cultural revival gets conceptualized within Dublin. And then you have figures like James Cousins who are coming into contact with all of that because they're, you know, because James Cousins is friends with Yeats and friends with AE along with his wife Margaret Cousins. And then they like physically go to India and then are kind of participating in these discourses in a newspaper that is set up by this kind of Irish-ish woman, Annie Besant, that's giving James Cousins this space to think through what's happening in terms of the Easter Rising and make these comparisons to what's happening in India. And he does write these, like, because he's writing as the literary sub-editor. He publishes these speeches that he's delivering to Indian audiences about the kind of question of like, what language should we be writing in? What does it mean for us to write in English? And kind of positing these points of similarity between the colonial struggle in Ireland and the colonial struggle in India, as well as saying like, we should be thinking in conversation with one another about how to generate strategies for responding to kind of colonial oppression. So I think it is like these, it's like things like the Dublin Theosophical Lodge, or, you know, or the kind of the group that winds up forming that Dublin Theosophical Lodge and the visit of Mohini Chatterjee, as well as like the newspaper New India, these things that are set up by Theosophy, they become these points where people are either physically brought into contact with one another or their work is being published alongside one another that generates the possibility for these kinds of anti-colonial solidarity. And then as you can see from what I was talking about with Besant, she's participating in all of these different institutions that are the kind of Indian nationalist institutions, even though she has this kind of complicated vision of what independence is going to look like, right? Like she like really is invested in the idea that India does need to remain entangled with England in order for the new era to come into existence. But she also believes deeply that there ought to be more autonomy within India. So she's really, I mean, the fact that she's actually interned, right? Like she is actively participating in this struggle, but then she also has this really kind of complicated vision of what she wants the results of that struggle to be. So I'm also trying to acknowledge that like while Theosophy provided this space for anti-colonial agitators to find their way to one another, it also it operated as a kind of container for anti-colonial solidarities, but because of the way that it thought about time and evolution and change and what the revolution ought to be, it also sort of restricted some of the ways in which that mode of revolutionary change could be conceptualized.
Thank you. And may I ask you, you know, about the Irish origins, right? I mean, Ireland has been a Catholic place for, I mean, compared to the heart of the empire, right? London and a Protestant. I mean, it comes into the conversation somehow, you know, having this long history, which is completely different, also from the headquarters. London and the rest of the empire. So I guess that maybe, how do you think this different history, this peculiar history of being in the colonized place itself, you know, compared to the rest of the world? Of course, it's not India, but somehow comes from a different cultural epistemic notion as well as religious, which is not secondary, especially if we're talking about spirituality, which is a completely different context. But just, you know, maybe has it somehow influenced or not, and you know, or does it even come in conversation? It's just something.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the majority of the Irish figures that I'm looking at who became so interested in Theosophy grew up Protestant. And I think like one of the things that people have tended to say in the past, right, is that these are figures who are kind of negotiating their relationship to an Irish nationalist project due to their own positionality as Irish Protestants, right, who might feel sort of sidelined from a more kind of like an Irish Catholic vision of what nationalism could be, and that linking themselves up with Theosophy almost becomes a way of kind of veiling from view the fact that they lack that kind of access to Irish Catholic identity. I don't know about that, but that's like I think that's like a kind of commonplace that people have said in the past. But I do think that the kind of the version of Theosophy that gets developed in Ireland is kind of distinct from the version that's getting developed even by Irish subjects living in India, right? Because like James Cousins, Margaret Cousins, Besant, like they are all like they're in India until they die. And so I think they're really interested in kind of moving back and forth between this more kind of like Hindu inflected vision of Theosophy and then thinking about what that might mean for a vision of a kind of Irish cultural revival. But I think for figures like A.E., who is positively obsessed with India but never actually goes there, his vision, like his kind of vision of Theosophy is grounded in this close reading of Hindu scriptures. Like he really does feel a sense of like deep, intimate kinship with the Upanishads, right? He's reading all of these things and they become kind of central to his vision. But then I think the next phase for him is sort of Irishifying that version of Theosophy, where he starts to kind of integrate certain visions of kind of like Irish mythology and fairy lore and things like that into the way that he approaches it. So I think he similarly to figures like Besant and Cousins does feel this kind of sense of like deep intimacy, kinship with coalition with India. But he never actually goes there, and he insists that he also like lived an entire life in India, and that's why he understands all of this material so well. But then he does wind up kind of reworking it in a more kind of directly Irish direction.
Thank you so much.
Philosophy is adaptable. It can move between all of these different places. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. I don't know if Charlotte and Paolo have questions. Charlotte has a question, or maybe a couple. We'll see.
I don't know. Well, yes, I do have a lot of questions. That was incredibly rich, Kristin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is not an area that I know very much about, so I'm really intrigued and also, frankly, a little bit shocked by some of the things that you said. I mean, they're very compelling ideas. But there are lots of I don't know questions that arise for me about the way in which notions of kinship are deployed. I was thinking about one of the phrases you said towards the end, that Besant leveraged intimacy for political purposes. Yes, I absolutely think that that is one of the things that we're seeing here.
Yeah.
Alongside that, we have this great narrative of how much love she had for India, how much love she had for this idea of a sort of a transracial, transnational brotherhood. That's the word that's being used, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about all kinds of different notions of, so the family, the idea of the family. We have within Christianity, the Holy Family, which is a hierarchy. We have the notion of the normative family, which is a hierarchy. We have ideas of brotherhood. I'm using that term because that's the one that's used, that is sometimes thought to be more equal and horizontal, although there was some text that you cited which said, no, it's not about being equal, there will still be a hierarchy. And there's something kind of quite uncomfortable, isn't there, in the way that we look at those family structures. She created this family structure, which is incredibly interesting and seems to have some very laudable ambitions at its heart, but at the same time, it becomes a kind of a trap. And there is, first of all, Krishnamurti as one of the adopted children who's given this role of the Messiah but made to keep silent. And then there's Rukmini, who sort of takes that role on and seems to have been married off to a much older man. And I'm wondering about the agency. If we think about the way that Krishnamurti then had to take a very long time to extricate himself. So there's something about an imagined, slightly fetishized notion of this queer kinship, which is both incredibly exciting on one level and masking coercion, perhaps. I mean, I wonder whether you could say a bit about how difficult it is to investigate and analyze these kinds of issues, because obviously you're looking at historic texts, you're dealing with archives. These are very difficult questions, and not everything will have been written down or documented. So wondered whether
Yes.
you could kind of open that can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, I think like everything about the way I'm approaching this, I think, is inflected by the kind of thinking that I was doing in the previous project. And I think that, in the last project, like I started that project with this idea that I was going to be writing about decadent queer kinship as, fundamentally utopian, as kind of creating all these new possibilities for intimacy and connection, that we're breaking free from the constraints of normativity. And that was one of the things that I wound up talking about in the book. And there are chapters in the book, like the chapter on Lawrence Hausman or the chapter on Vivian Holland, that I think are advancing that vision of a kind of queer kinship that is informed by decadence, that is coming out of Wildean thinking, that I think is really beautiful and really does lead to these really liberatory models of thinking about what connection might be. But also, as I did the research for the project, right, I was finding other examples of the ways in which decadence informed an approach to kinship that could potentially be more destructive or inhibiting. And I think like the chapter on that I wrote on Eric Gill, who, and there was a ton of abuse within his household, right? And that was sort of that he explained to himself using principles that I argue in that chapter are drawn from a kind of vision of kind of decadent Catholicism, a way in which a kind of eroticized kinship is the most beautiful thing that one can think of. And in order to kind of really enact that, you need to be fully eroticizing the kinship that's happening within your household. And so I think, and I felt like as I came across that material, I was like, I wanted to write a much happier book. But what I wound up writing was a slightly darker book, right? That kind of acknowledges the way in which the breaking open of taboos and the kind of rethinking of what intimacy and what connection and what kinship can look like can lead to these beautiful experiments that really do lead people in new directions. It can also, because of the ways that it's leveling taboos, like taboos can also kind of protect figures without agency, right? And it can protect children and protect animals, right? Like, and those figures are remaining unprotected when you burst open all of those taboos. And so I think that where I ended with that book, right, with this kind of vision of like the ways that that non-normative visions of kinship are as likely to harm as they are to liberate, right? I think that is the kind of thinking that I was, that was informing the way that I was thinking about this. And I really feel like the first time I started drafting this material, I didn't even really think that I was writing about kinship. And then I read the first draft and saw like this kind of language of family was coming up in almost every paragraph, right? And that is the language that is being deployed within Besant's thinking, within the kind of structures that are being created within this group, and within in a broader cultural sense, right, in the way that people are conceptualizing forms of nationalism during the exact forms of nationalism that Besant and Cousins and all of these people are in conversation with at this particular moment. It's always about brotherhood. It's always about the motherland. It's always about these forms of kind of like envisioning your loyalty to one another and your kind of your linked status within this rebellion as a form of kind of familial connection. But I think I also had to, and I want to insist upon the important work that kind of rhetoric did, right? Like I think like thinking about the role that Besant played in forms of nationalist agitation, thinking about the role that figures like AE in Ireland played in nationalist agitation. Those are things that I want to center and acknowledge. But I also do want to acknowledge the way that this kind of language of kinship, and especially when this language of kinship is being articulated through this kind of vision of deep time that Theosophy has, can make these connections feel like so enmeshed, so entrenched that there's no way out of them. All right. So like within this particular story that I'm telling here, like you do have this really interesting way, like Besant as this figure who's biological children are taken away from her because she's distributing material about contraception, right? Like she is engaged in a kind of like queer feminist project at the time. Her biological children are taken away from her. And then in the end, she winds up kind of creating this alternative family that does work. I mean, it does work to kind of rethink forms of national, religious, and racial distinction. Yes, it definitely does that. However, it's also something that Krishnamurti clearly felt like he needed to get away from, right? And I think it's interesting that in order to do that, he had to he couldn't just walk away. He had to generate an entire alternative philosophy and vision of time, and a kind of vision of what liberation is, and actually kind of like think through that, articulate it over time, till he could get to the point where he dissolved the Order of the Star, when he delivered that lecture at the Star Camp. So yeah, I think that's the way that I'm thinking about this kind of question of like kinship being. I think I keep coming over and over and over again with these projects. I keep coming in with this sense of optimism that I'm going to be like thinking about kinship as like always only as queer kinship as always only liberatory, right? But then when you actually start to work with the material, what's happening is actually so much more complicated than that. And I think that that's the difficulty I keep encountering, is like how to actually acknowledge the important political work that these imagined kinship ties were able to perform, while also acknowledging the impact that they had on the people existing within these structures, and people like Krishnamurti, who did find it so difficult to extricate himself from them. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think looking at questions of agency and power dynamics in any kind of relationship is just really, really important. And also being able to, well, somehow finding a way to acknowledge the potential liberatory or the potential disruptive energy of a particular conception of a new form of family that might have symbolically, but then also not shying away from the actual impact of that on the people involved if they don't actually have a choice in the matter, and the decision-making power of minors and all of those kind of issues. I mean, I was thinking about the idea of Benedict Anderson and the idea of the imagined community, you know, the motherhood, the brotherhood, the fatherhood, all of these things, the sense of nationhood that is imagined, and that what Besant did is she actualized that. But these are real people who are not necessarily in a position to be able to consent, and so I guess that the ethics of queer kinship, the ethics of queering kinship, is a really important question, which is quite a tricky one to talk about, because ethical frameworks are often, particularly in the 19th century, based in moralistic sort of roots, or potentially, if we're moving into the decadent movement, then what you have there is often something can be quite exploitative and self-serving, and so you're at this moment of kind of tipping the balance from one to the other. So it's a very delicate series of energies working in a different way, which is why I guess a queer framework is helpful to talk about that.
Yes.
I mean, have you been drawing on particular queer thinkers or queer ideas? Have you found that helpful for you to try and articulate what's going on?
I think every bit of reading and work that I did for the previous book on queer kinship, right, is informing all of the way that I'm thinking about this material here. So I think, and I think that I'm interested also, so I'm drawing upon all that kind of like longer tradition of thinking about queer kinship that I was drawing upon in the first book. But I think I'm also just sort of bowled over by the way that these figures themselves are theorizing this in their work, right? Like I think that letter that I read aloud from Besant, like seeing the way that she herself is kind of theorizing queer kinship within that text, right? And we talk so much about queer kinship being connected. I'm thinking about Elizabeth Freeman's work, right, where she's talking about queer kinship in relationship to kind of a queer visions of temporality, right? For her, that weird way of kind of rerouting time, thinking outside of reproductive futurity, but thinking about what it means to kind of continue into a future with your beloved, with your kin, as well as thinking about like how do we think about inheritances and genealogy, like that vision, like Freeman's vision of queer kinship and queer temporality, I think is always in the back of my head when I'm looking at a letter like that one that Besant wrote to Krishnamurti, right, where she's sort of saying to him, like, not only like were we together, like, like 15,000 years ago, but like we were minerals together, right? So this stretches back into time. So that innovative and kind of incredibly compelling thinking about time and connection that I think of as a kind of fundamental characteristic of queer kinship. That's happening there, but it's being deployed to very different ends than I think we're used to.
Well, exactly. It felt sort of, I don't know, because there was some science fiction being written at the time, but it feels sort of has a touch of sort of 1960s science fiction about it, or even Karen Barad, sort of that kind of idea. But it was being written about Krishnamurti, not with him.
Yes.
I think that's one of the interesting distinctions. So then it almost becomes a form of gaslighting or
I was thinking about like how it would feel as a young person to receive a letter like that, right? And like to like
very
and to also,
manipulative.
you know, and Theosophy did have this sort of like significant position within Madras at that time, right? So to have the person who is at the head of this movement, but also of this institution that is sort of central within your city that you're growing up in, to be writing you letters like that, like I think it's really, really hard for me to even imagine how that might have felt in the moment to get a letter like that, and how you would be able to think outside of that vision of time and that vision of kinship were you to receive something that loving time in such a complicated way, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Paolo, I don't know whether you want to come in.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I had the same curiosities. And first of all, Kristin, again, a rich presentation. It certainly doesn't seem like a project that it's at its inception. It seems quite complete and well researched, honestly. And I really appreciate these ethical questions that we're dealing with or grappling with. And I think you're doing an amazing job at trying to balance sort of the ethical judgments that we're trying to make here. And just to sort of reiterate some of the previous questions, yeah, who does the imagining and for whom, I think is really important here. And especially when we think about the parallel of colonial narratives of affiliation and infantilization, right? So I'm seeing a parallel there, right, from the more systemic to the more individual, but also systemic level, because we're talking about an institution here as well. Non-consensual care, so consent is emerging, I think, as a really key piece here. And I wanted to add another sort of concept here, question around, white savior complex. Is this something that you're thinking about, especially when it comes to these dynamics? And then a question that's very specific out of curiosity. I saw there was an image from 1912 in Taormina in Sicily in your slideshow, and so I'm curious, especially given Southern Italy's sort of historical state status as a racially ambiguous space, so as we're talking about transcultural kinships. Do you have any more information about that photo and why they were there and it was taken there?
You're asking about the moment that they go to Taormina, where I have the picture there. Yeah, that is in the moments when Krishnamurti's father is trying to get access to his son again, right? He's taking Besant to court to get custody back. And one of the main things that he requests is that Leadbeater no longer have access to his children because he's found out about these past charges. And at that point, they take Krishnamurti out of India, and he's kind of moving around Europe, and then they spend a good deal of time in Taormina, and that's where they're kind of going through these additional initiations. But I think like Taormina's position within queer history, right? All of the different kind of figures who have passed through there, it does kind of make it sort of significant that a lot of the queer kinship ties that are being solidified amongst this group, amongst Besant and Leadbeater, as basically Krishnamurti's new adoptive parents, along with Krishnamurti and Nitya and the other figures who are there with them, that it is like the kind of the consecration or the solidification of this queer kinship tie is happening in Taormina, in this space, with this incredibly rich past history in relationship to queer history. And I forget what the first part of your question was. What was the first thing that you asked?
The main sort of additional piece I wanted to bring to the conversation was white savior complex as a sort of push, as a motivation and an ethical stance.
Yeah, and I was on a panel with Sylvia over the summer at Inks, where I was really thinking through this question of, I think I showed you all that image that had kind of Annie Besant, builder of a new India. And when I received that book, I think I requested it through Interlibrary Loan, and I saw that title page along with that really striking image. That was one of the things that sort of got my thinking going. It's like, what does it mean for a woman with of Irish heritage, born in London, to conceptualize herself as the person who might be the builder of a new India? So that is something that I'm sort of thinking through. And I think that, my thinking about that keeps sort of changing and getting complicated, right? Because like that image, it really got me to thinking, like, at what point and how did she come to believe that that she was the one who was positioned to play that role? But I think also when I went to Chennai and I was doing all that work in the Theosophical Society headquarters and looking at their archives, and I was looking at these issues of New India and of this paper, and like thinking about the tremendous cultural work it was performing at that time, right? That like she was taking her access to resources, the fact that she had access to kind of publishing resources, to particular kinds of wealth that they were receiving through to donations, and was devoting that to establishing a newspaper that was about kind of promoting a vision of Indian independence and like providing a forum for Indian nationalist thinkers to kind of think in concert with one another. Like that is something kind of striking. And I was kind of talking with the archivist there about the amount of just the amount of physical work that she was performing in service to this cause, right? So I think that I'm again and again and again thinking about this question of the white savior complex and thinking about what makes an individual think they have the right to perform that work for another group, while at the same time acknowledging the fact that she did do this work, right? Like I haven't established an anti-colonial newspaper. You know what I'm saying? I'm not showing up every day to do that editing work. So I think that that's like one of the things that I'm trying to move back and forth between, and to also think about the way that the role that the Theosophical Society continues to perform in the city of Chennai. Like when I was doing research there, like looking at the schools that have been founded by the Theosophical Society, the way that the library, the Theosophical Society, continues to operate as a resource for the city. So I think I am kind of like, you know, oscillating back and forth between these kinds of like thinking about entering into a critical relationship with the way that she positions herself as central to a movement and why she thinks she's able to do that. While at the same time, really acknowledging the ways that she put herself and her body on the line, right? That she was actually like in turn, that she was showing up every day, performing this kind of work in service to this particular cause. But yeah, that's something I'm thinking through constantly as I do this research. Yeah.
I have a final question, just getting back to the issue of temporality or queer temporalities. What is, in your view, the legacy of Theosophy and its view on kinship?
I mean, I think that I don't think I would be able to understand anything about Theosophy unless I had actually gone to do that research at the headquarters in Chennai, because I think in my mind, I think when we're working as scholars in Victorian studies, for example, we're tending to think of that as a movement that that we're locating in a pretty like isolated and contained historical moment. But seeing the way that it continues to thrive and persist in Chennai, and the ways that it continues to be a kind of space that that kind of facilitates transnational connection, right? It has an incredibly international membership, and so many people are traveling to Chennai to attend workshops there, to attend the conferences there. But that it also continues to be an institution that is performing service for that city, right? The fact that they can like that kind of educational endeavors that were established by the Theosophical Society or established by Rukmini Devi or established by Krishnamurti, like all of those things remain in place and continue to do this incredibly kind of significant cultural work within the space of the city. And so I think for me, when I was thinking about Theosophy as a kind of like a Victorian phenomenon, right? Seeing the way that it is so much a kind of it continues to thrive and persist within the space of Chennai really, really complicated my vision of the afterlives of this vision of queer kinship. And I would say that it continues to do important political, cultural, and educational work within the space of Chennai.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's any more questions. We are very, very grateful. Thank you, Kristin. You've been very generous with sharing your work, your research work in the moment, for stimulating ideas, thoughts, you know, and also contaminating our own space of reflection and research. So it was a real pleasure to host you today. We look forward for future collaboration. So we will find other moments, I very much hope, to talk about queer kinship and transnational kinships. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me the space to talk about this new work and for the questions that really were so thought-provoking. I really, really, really appreciate the invitation. This was so lovely to be here with you all.
Thank you. Thank you. So have a lovely evening, everyone, and we'll see you soon for the next seminar that you will see advertised on the website. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.